5 fundamental truths written about in Trading in the Zone. One of them gets agreed with faster than any of the others and believed less than any of the others. Anything can happen. Say it out loud and it sounds almost childishly obvious. Of course, anything can happen. Every trader watching this video would nod along immediately. Nobody is going to argue that the market is somehow predictable, that surprises don't occur, that price can't do something nobody saw coming. And yet this single sentence, 4 words is, in my experience watching traders develop over years, the single hardest truth in the entire book to actually live inside of, not to agree with, to live inside of, in the sense that it shapes what you do in the specific moment when a setup looks unusually good and the temptation to treat it differently arrives. This video is going deep into this one truth alone because it deserves more than the few minutes it typically gets when all 5 are covered together. We're going to look at why this particular truth is so much harder to internalize than it is to recite. What's actually happening psychologically when a trader violates it, and what it would genuinely look like to trade from a place where this sentence isn't just something you know, it's something your body trusts before your mind has to remind it. Before we go further, I want you to answer something honestly, and I want you to really sit with it for a second rather than answering on autopilot. On a scale of 1 to 10, how certain do you feel about your best, highest conviction setup, the one you'd call your A+ trade right before you enter it? Not your confidence in your process generally, your felt sense of certainty about that specific trade in that specific moment. Comment the number below. I think most of you are going to be surprised by your own honest answer once you actually consider it instead of giving the answer you think you're supposed to give. Here's why this truth is so uniquely difficult, and it has to do with something almost nobody examines directly. The difference between what your conscious mind agrees with and what your nervous system has actually learned through experience. Your conscious mind can hold the idea that anything can happen without any resistance at all. It's a simple logical proposition, but your nervous system doesn't learn through logical propositions. It learns through repetition and reinforcement through pattern, outcome, accumulated over hundreds or thousands of repetitions until certain patterns become associated at a level beneath conscious thought with certain expected results. This is not a flaw in how your brain works. It's exactly how your brain is supposed to work, and it's enormously useful in almost every other domain of life. If you've touched something hot and been burned, your nervous system doesn't need you to consciously reason through the physics of heat transfer. The next time you see a stove, it has already encoded hot stove danger at a level that produces an automatic instant response. That's not a weakness, that's efficient adaptive learning. The problem is that this exact same learning mechanism, which serves you so well almost everywhere else, actively works against you in trading. Because trading is one of the only domains where pattern recognition, the very thing your nervous system is so good at, produces a dangerous illusion. You see a setup, it resembles other setups that worked before. Your nervous system, doing exactly what it's designed to do, generates a felt sense of expectation, not a conscious thought that says this will work. Something underneath that, a physical sense of rightness, of obviousness, of this being different from your other trades in some way that doesn't require justification because it just feels true. That felt sense is the actual obstacle to believing anything can happen. It's not an intellectual disagreement with the principle. It's a physiological response that arrives before any thinking happens, and it specifically targets the setups that look most familiar, which ironically means it targets your best setups most intensely, since those are the ones most likely to resemble past winners. This is why the truth is so much harder to apply than it is to state. You're not fighting a belief, you're fighting a trained physiological response that operates faster than conscious reasoning, and that gets stronger, not weaker. The more successful trades you accumulate using a particular pattern, because every additional win reinforces the association even further, let's talk about what this actually looks like in practice. Because I want this to be concrete rather than abstract. A trader develops a setup over months of work. Structure, confirmation, entry criteria. All of it refined through real trades and honest review. And within that setup, certain configurations start to stand out as the cleanest, most reliable versions, the ones that have produced the strongest results historically. This is normal. This is in fact exactly what a developing trader should be doing, paying attention to which expressions of their edge perform best. The problem begins at the next step, which happens almost invisibly. The trader starts to feel differently about those particular configurations. Not just this meets my criteria, but something closer to this is the real thing. This is when it actually works. And once that felt distinction exists, it inevitably starts to influence behavior. Even in traders who would tell you with complete honesty that they understand every valid setup carries genuine uncertainty. The position gets sized up, not dramatically. That's important to understand because dramatic violations are easy to catch. It's a quiet increase, maybe 20% larger than the plan specifies. Justifiable in the moment with reasoning that sounds completely rational. This is a higher quality setup, so it deserves more conviction. But conviction and uncertainty are not actually opposites in a probabilistic system. This is the part the truth is really pointing at, and it's subtle enough that most traders miss it even after reading the book. You can have complete conviction in your process, full confidence that your edge is real, that your criteria are sound, that over a large sample, this approach produces positive results, while simultaneously holding zero additional certainty about any individual trade's outcome. Those two things are not intention process conviction, and outcome uncertainty coexist completely comfortably in a trader who has actually internalized this truth. The trader who hasn't internalized it conflates the two. High conviction in the setup gets translated unconsciously into reduced uncertainty about the outcome. And that translation is exactly what produces oversized positions, loosened risk management, and the particular shock and anger that arrives when a great setup fails anyway. I want you to think about this specifically in relation to your own trading. Do you have a category of setup, a specific configuration, a specific pair, a specific time of day, anything that you would honestly admit you trust more than your others? Not as statistically your best performer, which might be objectively true and is fine to know. I mean a setup that produces a different felt sense in your body when you see it, more certainty, more excitement, less hesitation than your other valid setups. Comment what that specific setup or configuration is for you. I want you to name it specifically because identifying it is the first step in noticing when it's influencing your sizing or your risk management in ways your other setups don't. Now I want to walk through what actually happens mechanically when this particular setup fails, because the emotional aftermath reveals something important about what was really happening before the trade was even taken. When a trader's obvious high conviction setup loses, the emotional response is rarely just disappointment. It's something closer to disorientation, sometimes even anger that has a personal quality to it, as if the market did something it wasn't supposed to do specifically to them. This reaction is the clearest possible evidence that in the moment the trade was taken, the trader was not actually operating from anything can happen. They were operating from something closer to this particular thing was very likely to happen, and the market's failure to comply with that expectation registers as a violation rather than simply one outcome within a known distribution. Compare this to how the same trader typically responds to a loss on a setup they consider more marginal, more ordinary, less special. Those losses tend to be processed without much emotional charge at all. Didn't work, moving on is a completely normal, healthy response to a marginal feeling setup losing. The fact that the response is so different depending on how obvious the setup felt beforehand is itself the proof that uncertainty was never actually distributed evenly across these trades in the trader's mind. Even though, in objective reality, every single valid setup the trader takes carries genuine, irreducible uncertainty about its individual outcome. This is the actual cost of not internalizing this truth, and it's worth naming directly. It's not primarily a financial cost, though oversized positions on sure things certainly produce financial damage when those positions go wrong. The deeper cost is emotional. A trader who unconsciously believes certain setups carry less uncertainty than others is setting themselves up for a much more painful relationship with losses on those specific trades. Because those losses don't just cost money, they violate an expectation that was quietly, invisibly built into how the trade was approached from the start. So what does it actually look like to close this gap? Not to intellectually agree with this truth more strongly, but to genuinely change the physiological response that drives the violation. This is not solved through more reading or more repetition of the phrase itself. Telling yourself anything can happen in the moment before you take a high conviction trade does very little, because the felt sense of certainty we've been discussing operates below the level where self-talk has much influence. You cannot out-argue a trained physiological response with a sentence repeated in your head. What actually works is a specific kind of structural intervention, and it's one that directly targets the mechanism we've identified rather than trying to fight it through willpower. The first piece is what I'd call sizing uniformity as a non-negotiable rule. Every valid setup, meaning every setup that meets your full written criteria, gets exactly the same position size every single time, regardless of how it feels. Not approximately the same. Identical as a percentage of account equity. This rule exists specifically to remove the channel through which the felt sense of certainty translates into behavior. You can feel as much conviction as you want about a particular setup. The rule simply doesn't allow that feeling anywhere near your position sizing decision, because the decision was already made in advance by the calm version of you who wrote the rule before any specific trade's felt sense had a chance to influence it. The second piece is documenting the felt sense itself, specifically and honestly, as part of your trade journal. Not just what the setup was and what happened, but a simple, honest note on how certain this particular trade felt compared to your average setup. Recorded before you know the outcome. Over enough trades. This creates something genuinely valuable, a real data set showing whether your felt sense of certainty has any actual correlation with outcomes at all. For most traders who do this, honestly over a meaningful sample, the data reveals something humbling, that the setups which felt most certain do not actually win at a meaningfully higher rate than the setups that felt more ordinary. Seeing that pattern in your own data repeatedly over months does something that simply reading the sentence cannot do. It gives your nervous system direct accumulated evidence that the felt sense it's been generating is not reliable information, and nervous systems update based on accumulated evidence far more effectively than they update based on intellectual argument. The third piece is specifically rehearsing the response to a loss on a high conviction setup before it happens. Not hoping you'll handle it well in the moment, but deciding in advance exactly what you'll do and say to yourself when it occurs. Something as simple as a single prepared sentence. This setup carried the same irreducible uncertainty as every other valid trade I take. The loss is not a violation, it's the fifth truth and the first truth working exactly as they're supposed to. Having this prepared in advance means that in the actual moment of disorientation after a sure thing fails, you're not constructing a response from scratch in a state where clear thinking is already compromised. You're retrieving something the calm version of you already built. I want to close this video with something that I think reframes the entire difficulty we've been discussing. The fact that this truth is hard to internalize is not a sign that something is wrong with you as a trader. It's a sign that your nervous system is working exactly as nervous systems are designed to work. Learning from pattern and repetition, generating expectation based on accumulated experience, doing and trading exactly what it does successfully in almost every other domain of your life. The difficulty is not a personal flaw, it's a structural mismatch between how human pattern recognition naturally operates and what a genuinely probabilistic environment actually requires. And once you see it that way, as a structural mismatch to be addressed deliberately, rather than a disciplined failure, to feel ashamed of the entire problem becomes more solvable. Because you stop trying to fix it through willpower and start fixing it through the specific structural interventions that actually target the mechanism producing the violation. Anything can happen. 4 words, easy to read, easy to agree with, and genuinely one of the hardest beliefs a human nervous system will ever be asked to hold, while pattern recognition is simultaneously screaming that this particular moment is different. The traders who eventually trade from inside this truth rather than just beside it are not the traders with the most willpower. They're the traders who built systems specific enough to make the difference invisible in their behavior, so that whether a setup feels like a sure thing or feels completely ordinary, the size is the same, the risk is the same, and the response to whatever happens next is the same. That sameness, that radical consistency, regardless of how certain any individual trade feels, is what it actually looks like to believe that anything can happen. Comment below, based on everything in this video, what is the one specific change you're going to make to how you size your highest conviction setups starting with your very next trade? I want a real answer. Not a feeling, an actual specific behavioral change, because that comment written now while this is fresh is more likely to actually change your next trade than anything I've said in the last 15 minutes.